It's Ken Harbaugh with Against All Enemies on the MeidasTouch network. I've been a little slow in responding to Donald Trump's threat against General Mark Milley. It's not that I didn't have anything to say. It's just that I assumed I wouldn't need to, and that the media writ large would do its job. This story should be front page news everywhere, but it has barely registered. Here's the former commander-in-chief on Truth Social saying that our nation's top uniformed officer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, should be put to death. Quote, "This guy turned out to be a woke train wreck who, if the fake news reporting is correct, was actually dealing with China to give them a heads up on the thinking of the President of the United States. This is an act so egregious that, in times gone by, the punishment would have been death." End quote. Part of me doesn't want to even bother explaining the backstory here, because there is no situation in which a comment like this from a former president is appropriate. But there are enough people trying to justify Donald Trump's rhetoric here that I think the context needs to be laid out. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff speaks with his counterparts on a regular basis. It's one of the most important things he does. And that includes not only speaking to allies to align strategies and set priorities, but also talking to our adversaries so that misunderstandings don't lead to conflict. This is one of the ways we avoid wars. General Milley, acting in his official capacity as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was doing his job. The fact that he had to reassure a strategic adversary, China, that the U.S. wasn't going to start World War III because of an erratic commander-in-chief, Donald Trump, should be the bigger story here. This is how NPR reported on Milley's conversations with his counterparts. Milley confirms that he spoke to Lee and other world military leaders in October and in January, but Joint Staff spokesperson Colonel Dave Butler said those communications were part of his normal duties and responsibilities, quote, conveying reassurance in order to maintain strategic stability, end quote. Butler also said Milley did not break protocol in the way he got in touch with Lee. Quote, all calls from the chairman to his counterparts, including those reported, are staffed, coordinated, and communicated with the Department of Defense, end quote, as well as the U.S. security and intelligence community's interagency pipeline, Butler said. Here is General Mark Hertling explaining why this is so important.
And truthfully, Jim, as a former senior general in the Army, you do things that are called engagements with your counterparts, with your peers in other countries. You try and actually contribute to the diplomacy of the United States by talking to your military colleagues and cohorts in other countries. That's what General Milley was doing. And when you talk about the kind of engagements he has to make around the world, by last count, I think the United States engages with about 192 different countries. So Milley is trying during his term of office to become familiar with those generals, to kind of assuage them when things are happening on the diplomatic or the political front, to tell them what's going on and to assure them, as well as deter them from doing things that are counter to the United States. He also assures them so that they don't get on a trigger stance and start doing things that would lead to unfortunate conflict or even war.
This, however, is much bigger than a conflict between Trump and his top general. It's about a president bent on revenge, using all the power of the government to persecute his perceived enemies. He has said himself that if elected again, his presidency will be about retribution. Here's Mark Esper, Donald Trump's own defense secretary, laying it out.
Milley's tenure was extraordinary. He did a great job. He has served honorably, and he deserves our praise and thanks. And he does not deserve what he's receiving from President Trump right now.
You mentioned this new reporting. There is a new piece in The Atlantic, and part of that says that Milley has told friends that he expects, if Trump does return to the White House, which he's obviously trying to do, that the newly elected president will come after him. And Milley has reportedly told people, quote, he'll start throwing people in jail and I'd be on the top of the list. Do you think that's a justified concern?
Look, I think it's a legitimate fear. If you recall from my memoir that you mentioned at the top, I cite a circumstance where the president, egged on by his close advisors, wanted to call back to active duty Admiral McRaven and General McChrystal to court-martial them for some things that they allegedly said in the public domain. And Milley and I had to talk the president out of doing that for any number of reasons. So is it possible that a new loyalist sitting around Trump in the Oval Office will say, let's call up Milley? Yeah, it's quite likely. Now, the good news is if there's a silver lining in all this, is Trump's kind of poisoned the well. I don't know that a jury could or anybody would find that he could be given what we would call command influence, that such a thing could happen. But nonetheless, I think it's a legitimate fear. The president's also said that a second term would be about retribution, right? So I think these are all legitimate concerns.
But can we just take a moment? And I mean, you were his Pentagon chief. The former defense secretary is saying that it is a legitimate fear that the former commander-in-chief, who is seeking to be the commander-in-chief again, would want to seek retribution against someone like General Milley simply because he doesn't like the way that tenure is being reported in books and in articles.
Yeah, and I think simply also because the way Milley conducted himself, which was to offer candid, frank advice. If it wasn't what the president wanted to hear because of what Milley was saying, or he didn't want to hear what I was saying, look, he doesn't like that. He wants to find yes men in his office. And so, yeah, he would do that. It's hard for me to believe I'm saying that as well. I wish I didn't have to say that. But if I didn't have the experience in the Oval Office with President Trump seriously wanting to call back to active duty McChrystal and McRaven to court-martial them, I would be less certain. But unfortunately, it is what it is.
Thanks for listening, everyone. I've got a quick break here, but I need a favor first. Shows like this depend on your support. Please, if you can spare 5 seconds, click the link to the podcast version of the show below and leave us a 5-star review. It really does help. Thanks. We cannot just let this go. Nothing about this is normal, and we need to call it out. Not because it's going to change Donald Trump's behavior. We all know that's hopeless. But there are others, Trump acolytes, we might be able to shame or deter. The problem we face whenever Trump crosses yet another line is that he brings people with him. Here is Paul Gosar, a sitting U.S. congressman, repeating Trump's call for Milley to be executed.
Republican Congressman Paul Gosar is echoing former President Donald Trump, suggesting that outgoing Joint Chiefs Chairman Mark Milley should be, quote, hung for his supposed disloyalty to Donald Trump. In a bizarre rant published on his government website today, the Arizona Republican accuses General Milley, without evidence, of conspiring with Democrats to delay law enforcement response on January 6th. The rhetoric is eerily similar to comments Trump just made on Truth Social, writing, in times gone by, Milley's punishment would have been death.
The rhetoric of political violence, unless interrupted early enough, only escalates. If the Republican Party is too cowardly to call out Donald Trump directly, perhaps they can at least avoid echoing his calls for violence and maybe even hold people like Paul Gosar accountable. Ultimately, the final decision lies with voters. 2024 will be our chance to send a resounding message that these kinds of incitements to violence have no place in American politics.